how do we respond when we get called out? How do we help each other grow? Because like you said, this community is all about learning. I think as leaders, we try to model that and we try to live by that, but we really want everyone in this community to be all about how do we learn? Because we're coming from a sex negative culture. The majority of us, I think it's safe to say, grew up in an incredibly problematic culture in a lot of ways. Sex negativity, but also racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, like the whole list. And so coming into this space, we've got a lot of growing to do, and we can only do that by helping each other grow.
Welcome to the Give and Consent podcast. The goal of this show is introducing you to the people and ideas behind sex positivity. And today I'm excited to be joined by Dawn Woodard, the Executive Director of Sex Positive World. Thank you for joining us, Dawn.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. So kind of my first question for you is, right now we're at the end of 2020, and you took over as Executive Director for Sex Positive World in June, which of course was for this year, kind of the middle of the pandemic. What has that experience been like, and what changes have you caused for us within Sex Positive?
Well, I think I really picked up where Karen Heary and Gabriela Cordova left off in transforming Sex Positive World into, frankly, more of a thing than it used to be. So I think there's been not only pandemic related changes this year, but also just organizational changes, because we're at a stage of organizational growth where we're able to become more of a substantial organization than we used to be. We used to be a lot smaller and exist basically to help chapters get started in local areas. And now we're actually having our own events, and we have more of a more substantial board and people who are more actively developing resources in our organization. So there's really just been a lot of changes, but it's been certainly challenging to navigate the pandemic. And I know we spent a lot of time in June and July when I first took over just talking about, okay, how do we feel about events? How do we navigate? Especially, we have an annual in-person event called Convergence every year. And this year we had to have a lot of conversations about how we felt about endorsing that event or not as a community because of the risks. So it's been a really fun challenge for me, honestly. I like thinking about problem solving and figuring out what we can do differently. And I think it's really brought us together as a global sex positive community in ways that wouldn't have been possible without the pandemic. So as much as the pandemic is obviously horrible and devastating globally, it has had some benefits for us as a community because people are looking for connection, and we can provide that in virtual events. And so we've been able to have really high attendance at our core workshops and our classes that we've been offering this year.
On that topic of classes and things that we offer, I know that you've been involved with a lot of what we call core classes. These are what every chapter is kind of, I can say, required to do. Like we have an orientation and a class on boundaries and how to have a safer sex talk. What kind of happens behind the scenes, and what are those classes about?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, the core classes that we're offering right now, we have our orientation, which is basically, here's what our community is, here's what we see sex positivity as, and introducing people to their local chapters as well, if there is one near them. Awesome Boundaries is all about consent and boundaries, how to navigate it, what challenges come up, how do we, actually, what are the things we can do to put that into practice? So we always have interactive activities where people get to practice that. And then Safer Sex Talk workshop, which is currently in development. So we will see that coming out hopefully in 2021. But behind the scenes, we're really volunteer-oriented organizations. So we love doing these core classes with kind of as many people as want to help out, which can get a little chaotic, but I think is really valuable to just give people opportunities to get involved, to contribute, to give back, and we let people take small bites. So, we have a lead facilitator for these core workshops, and that's the person who sort of organizes meetings and does a lot of the presentation development and makes sure it's all kind of set. And then other people can contribute ideas for things they might want to change. They can come in and take a small piece of the facilitation, or they can help out as a tech support or emotional angel so that they're available when people need help throughout the workshop. So we have really pretty big development teams for all of these core workshops. And, I really enjoy the process. We always say in this community, we value enthusiasm over perfection. So someone who comes in and really cares about this is much more valuable to us than someone who is just like a technically perfect presenter, but doesn't necessarily care about the material. So
No, I love that about Sex Positive, because it's letting people step in and try it on, even if you're not a professional presenter. I got involved in the boundaries one. That was my first time teaching the boundaries class, and it was great.
yeah.
What I really love about it also is that we tend to take a very compassionate approach. And you've talked a lot about yourself, like being like waking up to issues that might exist in our community that can be really invisible if you're not paying attention to it, like specifically around inclusion and ableism, issues around race or the LGBT community. What is your passion around that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I notice just being part of the sex positive community for the last 6-ish years was that it's very primarily white, cisgender, heterosexual, and a lot middle-aged, and very able-bodied, among other privileges. So I think, this community has done a lot to think about, how do we challenge a lot of sexual norms, particularly between like men and women of gender binary there. We think more about that. And we certainly think about challenging this very narrow idea of what sex is. We open it up to more kinky sex and sometimes more queer sex. But I think we really struggle, particularly when it comes to issues of racism and ableism, in sex positive movements, and thinking about just recognizing the ways in which those issues are not talked about, not addressed in these communities, really don't center those people. And I think that's something that our organization is particularly guilty of. I think there are other sex positive spaces where that's not true, where they've been much more intentional. So that's something that I would love to see change in this community. And I recognize that I'm one of those people with privilege. I'm white. I identify as trans and non-binary, but and pansexual, but I'm also cishet passing most of the time. So, I have a lot of those privileges. And so one of the things that we are really trying to work on is how do we step back as the people with privilege in this community and bring forward more voices that we need to be hearing from, that help us understand what we're missing here. So that's been a big push this year. We have a really cool piece of our organizational structure called an advisory board, where they are basically an at-choice involvement part of our organization, where there's no commitment. We just, as board members, go to them when we need something and we say, here's something we're working on. Who has time and energy to give feedback on it? And so something we've done this year is bring in a lot more people of color, and particularly Black people, onto that advisory board. And we've been really intentional about talking with them and working with them to make sure that the things that we're doing for them or that affect them are actually in line, doing what they should be. So that's something that I've been, definitely passionate about making sure happens. And yeah, I'm really excited about. I feel like it's been really helpful for me. I've learned a lot. And I'm definitely here to keep learning and keep growing and figuring out what else I don't know about what we should be doing to create this community in a way that's truly radically sex positive and not just this sort of mainstream idea of sex positivity where like, yay, sex is good. We should have more sex, which is pretty limited and doesn't do anything to address the disparities that already exist in the world around who has access to sex, who is seen as valuable in our society sexually, which are huge. And who has access to really being able to say no, to give consent, to find their pleasure and find their desire. These are all issues of class, of race, of, able versus not able-bodied. Like these are super important things that our communities need to be thinking about, and I think have not done anywhere close to enough thinking about. I know that was a really long answer,
No,
but
that's great. I just want to pause for a minute because you use a word in there that can be really triggering for people. And the word is privilege. And that's one where I find people can get really upset to the point of denying that it's a concept that exists in our world. To the point of it can get really frustrating. And then there's those of us who go, oh, it does exist. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. So when you use the word privilege, what does that mean to you?
yeah, thank you for flagging that, because I agree. I think people get very caught up in it. So privilege to me means very simply that, so if we're talking about privilege around race, privilege can apply to a lot of different categories. So privilege around race is maybe the most common. So if I'm talking about privilege around race, I'm white. So I would say I have racial privilege, because if there was someone who was Black who had the exact same life conditions that I had all of the other same identities I had, literally like grew up exactly as poor as I grew up, like literally all the same circumstances. The only difference is their skin is Black. They would have had a harder life than I had because their skin is Black. So I have racial privilege for that reason. But similarly with gender, I'm not a man. Men have more gender privilege in this society. And so if I grew up in the exact same circumstance, but I were a man, my life would have been a little bit easier for that reason. So that's the gender privilege. So that's how I think about privilege. And it falls along a lot of different lines. So people can look at ways in which they do have some privileged identities, but other not privileged identities. And there's lots of intersections around marginalized identities that are important as well, but we don't need to get into intersectionality theory here. And I'm also not the person to teach that.
Yeah, so kind of just to summarize, it's like this idea that the face you're wearing defines how far you can go in society, like regardless of circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, we're both in America, and even that affects how we're looking at it also.
Yes. Yeah. All these conversations are more complicated as soon as we are thinking globally, and how do these same issues we talk about here, affect other countries, especially not white majority countries.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's something I love about Sex Positive, because like I said, we're very compassion focused. We like to be in that learning mindset of, oh, we didn't know that this would be a problem. How do we face it and take responsibility?
Mm-hmm.
And I know also we're developing a class specifically around intersectionality. What is intersectionality? That's maybe where we should start.
So as I just mentioned, I'm really not the best person to teach on what intersectionality is, but it was a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. I don't remember how recently, but I'm not even going to hazard a guess, but it was, within the last couple of decades, very wide range. That's all I got. And it's talking about the intersections of these identities. So it's basically saying if you're, Black and a woman, your experience is much harder than if you're just a woman or just Black. And it's actually more than the sum of those. It's like the extent to which your experience is worse because you're Black and the experience is worse because you're a woman, the combined effect is greater than the sum, if that makes sense. because they intersect in important ways that make things more difficult. And so I think that class is actually, I don't know how much we're going to go into intersectionality if we're going to actually shift it away from that, because that's a much more complex and nuanced topic. And I think what we're really going to focus on for that class is kind of intro level 101. What do you need to know in a sex positive community about your identities and about how to engage with people of different levels of privilege in our community, and think about some of the things that I mentioned a minute ago that a lot of sex positive movements aren't thinking about. So part of that is how to respond when someone calls you out on something racist you said, something sexist you said, something otherwise problematic that you said, how to respond. And so we've developed this phrase, thank you for helping me grow. It's not necessarily about the exact wording, that doesn't matter so much, but having the intention of when you get called out, just appreciating like, hey, thanks for believing that I can be better, taking the time and emotional energy to teach me something. I really appreciate you doing that. Thank you. Instead of like, what do you mean I'm not racist? I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't mean to say something wrong. Like, that's not really helpful or productive. So I think a big takeaway from that class is just, how do we respond when we get called out? How do we help each other grow? Because like you said, this community is all about learning. I think as leaders, we try to model that and we try to live by that, but we really want everyone in this community to be all about, how do we learn? Because we're coming from a sex negative culture. The majority of us, I think it's safe to say, grew up in an incredibly problematic culture in a lot of ways. Sex negativity, but also racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, like the whole list. And so coming into this space, we've got a lot of growing to do, and we can only do that by helping each other grow. And I just want to add the other main takeaway from that class is staying in our lanes. So recognizing when we're not the person who should be talking about the subject. So if there's someone talking about experiences of ableism, me as an able-bodied person should not be the one to be like, oh yeah, let me comment on that. Or are you sure that's really been your experience? Not helpful, right? It's the person who has the lived experience of that marginalization or that identity who's the person we should be listening to. And so recognizing when we're in places of privilege, when our privileged identity is the one that's being talked about, step back, listen to the person with the marginalized identity talking about their experience, and really, prioritize that. So those are the two things that I'm hoping people will take away from that class. And yeah, we're still tailoring that to a world level. It's been developed in SB Portland. And so we're working on that, and hopefully we'll have that out very soon in 2021.
No, and I love that saying thank you to the person who has corrected you, because a strange thing happens when you're accused of doing the wrong thing, where you have this shame reaction and you want to push back. And one of the ways that first showed up for me was, we talk about consent a lot in sex positive because it's important, it's easy to get wrong, and you kind of rediscover, I feel like, over and over again, where the lines are for you about what's okay and what's not okay.
Absolutely.
And we use this statement also, thank you for taking care of yourself. And I've seen people's lives just transform when they realize that it's okay to say no, because we live in a culture where it's really not okay to say no. If your boss wants you to take that job, you say yes. If that thing wants to happen, if someone says no to you, you better turn it into a yes. And like that for me was very transformational. And as you're talking about this around race, I just want to associate those two ideas. The idea is some people cannot say no because of who they are or the situation that they find themselves in. So I love it, just connecting those ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so important to learn that not only is it okay to hear a no, and then you can say, thank you for taking care of yourself, but it's also okay to be called out, and you can say, thank you for helping me grow. that these are both challenging feelings to have. They bring up, like you said, they bring up a lot of stuff. You want to be like, wait, why don't you want to say yes to me? Why are you saying no? Why don't
Mhm.
you want to do that thing? Or you want to say, what do you mean? I didn't mean to hurt you. I'm not racist. I'm not whatever. And in both cases, we get to have this, like, feel those feelings, acknowledge them, recognize them, and let them go as you turn toward appreciation and gratitude and remind yourself that that's not what it's about.
Yeah, I love that. So, another thing that we see in sex positives, many of our chapters are in big cities. And I know that a goal for you as executive director is to make sure that this can spread out to rural areas as well. Like, why is that important to you?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in rural Appalachia, up in the northwest corner of North Carolina. So I definitely have a passion for um, connecting all of this to rural spaces. I love my home. I love where I grew up, and I would love to see these ideas be more accessible in rural communities, which is a challenge. I lived in Los Angeles for 6 years while I was doing my PhD, and I got to see this contrast between all of this, you know, all of these big ideas that are being developed in cities because we've got so many people together with, in so many specific communities who are having all this conversation and developing culture. And then, I come back home and I see like how few of those ideas have managed to make their way to um, to where I grew up. And I think it really takes a while for these ideas to filter, and that's fine, except that I also see people in the cities being really frustrated that other places haven't got it yet. And like that people keep coming around being like, what do you mean? What's Black Lives Matter mean? What's cultural appropriation? And people are coming in with these questions, and you're in the city, like, obviously it means this. How the hell do you not know what it means yet? um of course, like, how are there still people asking about this? And I got to see firsthand that there are still people asking about it because it just hasn't gotten there yet. And so that's just something I see that I would love for us to be aware of in the sex positive community, that all of these ideas about consent and the way we're thinking about it just takes a while to reach these rural areas. And so I would love for us to be working on how do we make our core classes accessible, culturally accessible in a way that like makes sense and is approachable to in places where they really haven't done as much thinking about this yet. So we've got some examples of that. We've got some chapters in more conservative areas that are one that's working on getting started and one that has been going for a long time. And so they've got some models of how to talk about this in more conservative areas. But what we haven't really done is get it rural. It's in cities, but we haven't seen this rural. And so I think that's a strength of the world level. And the fact that we have events at the world level this year is we can actually, if someone has a computer and internet access, which is not true everywhere, certainly not true everywhere rurally, but there's only so much we can do about that piece. But at least if you have a computer and internet, you can come to our workshops. But I think we do need to do some thinking about how to make sure that they're accessible, and maybe is there like a even earlier step than orientation and awesome boundaries that we might offer to kind of bring people in from a more rural area.
No, I love that because I do feel like these concepts really are for everybody. And it can feel a lot like, oh, that's for them and not for me when you come from that kind of culture.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that in my community of people saying like, well, that's like big city stuff, that's like the highfalutin stuff they do in Los Angeles and New York and whatever, but that doesn't really apply out here. So I think there are a lot of ways we can bring these ideas, but we have to be careful about how they're intentional, I guess, about how they're packaged and how we talk about them.
So you also identify as a non-binary person, and I want to talk a little bit about like what does that mean and how does that translate in our sex positive events and our spaces?
Yeah, happy to talk about it. So I do identify as non-binary. I use they them pronouns, and it's kind of been an interesting identity journey for me. Um, I didn't always know that this was true for me. I identified as a girl, a woman for a lot of my life, but at a certain point, I just kind of hit a wall where that didn't feel right. And I think it was really through learning that non binary was a thing. I think I've always felt between genders, outside of genders, somewhere in between. Um, but I didn't know that there was another option. So I kept sort of trying to force myself into the girl box, because that's all I knew. Again, conservative, like rural area, didn't know any trans people, much less any non-binary people. So for me, I was just like, girl, I guess, sure. Um, and then when I actually started meeting other trans people and non-binary people and recognizing that, like, oh, I don't have to force myself into this box, um, there was sort of a point at which a switch flipped, and I was like, wow, I am really clear that that identity doesn't feel okay anymore. And it was really confrontational. I actually, for a little while in there, when it was super new, I would have like panic attacks when I would try to like go to a public bathroom because it was making me pick a gender. And I was like, none of those feel right. None of those are me. Yeah, it was really interesting to watch my emotional process because it hit so suddenly. So it didn't really give me a lot of time to think about it. It was just like, oh, it's here. I'm something else. Okay. Um, but yeah, I think it's definitely calmed down now. It's still a journey. I'm still feeling it out. All I can do is trust my internal sense of self. You know, there's no gender test that you can take. I think people talk about biological gender, or biological sex as if it's some like clearly measurable thing, but frankly, it's not. You've got genitals you can look at, sure. You've got chromosomes you can technically test, but how many people ever test your chromosomes? You've also got internal organs and reproductive system. You've got secondary sex characteristics. You've got like components of the brain. And all of these things don't necessarily align. They could, but they don't always. A lot of times they do, which is nice for cisgender people. But for those of us who are in between, there's not some like test we can take. You can't, you even if you could measure all of the things I just mentioned, if they're not all in alignment, there's no box for it anyway. So, you know, the only thing we can really do when it comes to gender is look at our internal sense of self and figure out what that feels like. And that's the best gender test we have. So that's what I've been going with. And my internal sense of self is just I think about boy and I think about man, and that doesn't feel like me. And I think about woman and girl, and that doesn't feel like me either. And so all I know is I'm something else, and we don't really have, there are lots of like great terms that people have come up with, but for now, non-binary is just a clear, like, neither of the binary things. And that's what I use it for. So that's been me and gender, and you know, still learning and figuring out, and really just trying to keep in touch with what I feel like and where I'm at, what my responses are. Some days I feel a little more fluid. Like some days I feel more girl or feel more boy, but it's not consistent. So yeah, it's been really interesting and eye-opening in a way that just learning about gender from my trans friends couldn't have prepared me for. It's definitely very different to experience it than to just hear the stories about it.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I love this also the idea of gender. And I want to also mention the ideas of masculinity and femininity which is something that I strongly relate to because I'm someone who comes from a very masculine field, but I'm a woman doing that job, and that is how I feel doing it. So how is that masculinity and femininity a little different than identifying as non-binary?
Yeah, so I see masculinity and femininity. I mean, it's all a construct, right? These
Yeah.
are all socially created ideas. And so we do have like things that are stereotypically masculine. Um, but anyone of any gender identity can do those things. And I think this ties into gender expression, right? Which is different than gender identity. So I might identify as a girl and still present, express my gender more masculine, but it doesn't change my identity necessarily. And I know there are lots of trans folks who choose to do that for safety reasons, who might be very clear, like, no, I'm a woman, that's my identity, but I'm going to present as a guy because I was assigned male at birth and everyone sees me as a guy. And it's just a hell of a lot easier and safer to keep doing that thing, as long as that's, comfortable for me. Um, my gender presentation as a non-binary person changes from day to day. Some days I do present more feminine and some days I present more masculine and some days more in between, and it really varies. So I think, yeah, it's important to distinguish those. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
I think you also asked about my experience as a non-binary person in sex positive spaces.
Oh yeah,
I think
absolutely.
I missed that half of your question because I was waxing on about my gender identity. But yeah, to go into that, it's a challenge because of some of the things that I said earlier, about the ways in which sex positivity hasn't done a lot of thinking about gender outside of the binary genders. Um, and so there's a lot of people in the community who just don't know what non-binary is, don't think about pronouns or care about pronouns or understand pronouns once you talk about them, um, and who just really want to put you into a binary box. And so it makes it complicated. I wrestle with, being someone who can pass as a woman. And I spent a lot of my formative years of my sexual identity as a woman. And so it's very easy for me to conform to what's expected and to sort of present as a woman in a sex positive space and sort of default to more like feminine sexuality, hardcore quotes there. But to sort of default to what I used to do. But then it feels icky internally because people are seeing not me. They're seeing me as this thing that they want to project onto me, but they're not actually able to see me and recognize me. And so it doesn't feel great, but it also feels very easy and accessible. And so trying to do something else and trying to force people to see me as something else is a challenge. And so, I'll be honest, like I feel most comfortable playing with other queer and trans people because they see me. They see me as me and they're not wrestling with all of these complexities or trying to put me into a box that's not me. So yeah, it's been a really interesting thing to navigate. And I think we've gotten better about pronouns as a community somewhat, but like most of our events, we talk about pronouns. Everyone is expected to share pronouns when everyone's sharing and introducing themselves. But I think there are a lot of people who haven't really done a lot of thinking and understanding about what that means, in terms of sexuality. So yeah, it's been a mix. It's definitely a challenge. I definitely run into people who don't understand what pronouns even are, or how to use them.
Definitely. Um,
So yeah.
or the thing using they them pronouns would mean I'm not on the binary, I'm not on the far ends. And then people go, but that means it's plural. And I'm like, language changes over time. We can learn this new concept. We can do this.
And also, it's not that new a concept. So it's even, they as a neutral, singular neutral, has been around for forever. It's actually just been in the last like couple of centuries that we haven't used it, that we've said he, she when we needed some singular gender neutral. But we used to use they like before that. So it's been around for a while. There's precedent. I think people can work with it. And I totally agree. Language is an ever evolving thing. And we get to accept that it changes. The whole idea that language is static, I find really problematic, because so many new terms have evolved literally since I was born. There's lots of new words that weren't words when I was a kid. And so, yeah, I love that about language. I think it's beautiful. I love watching the creation happen. So I think the more people can just sort of let that relax a little bit, let language evolve and be a fun, just co-created thing that we do as a culture, I think is really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And something I love also about pronouns, the way I put it to people is those are pronouns other people should use when they're talking about you. And that is because not everyone looks like the pronouns that they actually use. So it's better to ask than to assume. Like it's another point of being compassionate and understanding of where the other person's coming from instead of making an assumption that you already know.
Yeah, I think the more we can start thinking of pronouns as akin to names, the better, because we don't just, I wouldn't just walk up to you and be like, I'm just going to start calling you Mary now.
Yeah.
If I didn't know your name, right? Like I would ask your name. And so the more we can stop thinking that we can just assume someone's pronouns in the same way that we wouldn't just blindly assume someone's name, I think the better off we'll all be.
Yeah. So, about sex positive spaces, it looks like we're going to have them again sometime in 2021. What is coming out of the year, the age of COVID look like for sex positive moving forward?
That's a great question, and one that we are still figuring out. And I think we will be learning in the moment how that works. I think it's really different for our chapters than for us in Sex Positive World, because we're this umbrella organization over our chapters. And so our chapters are local organizations. They can have in-person events. So as soon as COVID has slowed and stopped in their area, they're going to be going back to delicious, yummy, in-person, sexy events, which will be really exciting. And I think there's going to be, I don't know, it'll be interesting to see how much like wariness there is of those versus just everyone's raring to go. And as soon as the gates are opened, everyone's just going to be like flooding back to those events. I think I would be in the latter box. I will be very excited to go back to in-person events.
Oh, yeah.
When they're a thing. But for us at the world level, we may actually see a decrease in our events for the same reason, because our events are always going to be virtual. We will be able to have our annual in-person, convergence or something like that again, I think maybe in 2022. I don't think it'll be possible in 2021, but maybe I'm overly pessimistic. We'll be able to have that again, but otherwise we're going to be offering our core classes always virtually. And so I'm expecting that there's going to be a certain drop in it as soon as people can have their in-person events, and they're going to be really excited to go back to those. So we're going to need to see what are the events that people are still motivated to come to virtually. How are we able to do things that are still interesting to people virtually? Because I think like a beautiful thing we offer, and what I've heard from attendees, is they get to meet people from Europe and from South and Central America when they come to our events, and they get to talk to people with other sex positive backgrounds and ideas, and bring all of this together, which I think is really, really beautiful. But how much is that going to compare to be able to be in person at a sexy event, right? So I'm not, we're gonna be learning as we go kind of how this changes, and probably pulling back the number of our offerings so that when we do have something, it's more special and more infrequent, so people are more excited to come to it. Um, and then probably some really intentional things, bringing together people from different cultures to sort of highlight that aspect of what we do. But yeah, I think it's going to be a challenge, and my executive director term ends in June, so we'll see what that'll be. Mostly a challenge for the next executive director to step up and get to do. Um, but I will still be on the board and definitely still here to help navigate that.
Nice, nice. Before I ask my last question, where can people find out more? Like where can people find you or Sex Positive? Like, how do they get involved with us?
Yeah, so a great way to get involved with us, we have our website, which is just sexpositiveworld.com. But people can also reach out to us on the board at spworldboard@gmail.com. Those are really the easiest ways. We do have a Facebook group for our community, but you need to have come to one of our core classes before you can join that Facebook group. And we're working on other social media outreach, but right now, like I mentioned early on, we're still building up our staff, so we're still a little limited right now, but we will hopefully have more social media outreach soon.
Nice. So my last question is, here we're in this age of isolation. It does not feel very sexy. What advice do you have for listeners about how to better get through this time and get to the other end of this pandemic?
Honestly, it's a hard question because it so differs depending on where you're at and what your risks are and how much you're actually able to take some amount of risk. I think there are good options for really carefully and intentionally navigating boundaries around COVID with a partner. Maybe you started dating someone over the pandemic and you've gotten to know them well enough that you really trust them enough to make agreements with them and form a pod and have them come in. And I think that's really beautiful when you can do that. But not everyone has that luxury. Some people are really just have too high risk in terms of COVID and really need to stay isolated. And so that's where I think there's some possibility for, really beautiful connections that I've seen come out of sex positive events that we're doing virtually, where we still can have connections and still can do human interaction things, even though they're not in person. And it doesn't replace touch. We don't get the same, chemical releases from that. But I think there've been some really really fun, cool connections that we've seen. We're about to have a really fun, sexy New Year's party. There's some other, just sexy groups that I'm in that do regular things, just solar masturbation within a community. There are great sexy virtual date options. But it's a challenge. And so, I mostly just want to acknowledge it sucks and it's hard. And I'm someone who doesn't live with a partner. So I'm definitely feeling the lack of touch and connection on a regular basis. But yeah, I mostly just think it's hard, and I don't have a lot of good advice except to, try to find the ways that you can stay connected and try to come to, events when you can that still bring people together and get you to see other people's faces and do just heart things, things that really touch other people's hearts and your heart, is for me the best thing that I can do when I can't have physical touch. So it's not a great answer, but I don't have easy answers to any of this right now.
Yeah. Well, but thank you for that. I definitely want to say thank you for being on the podcast. Everyone, if this sounds of interest to you to be at these online events, Sex Positive World, we make them, there's moneyless access if you're someone who just really can't afford to come to an event. We are really all about the inclusion and connection. So come check it out. It's worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. Please do.
Yeah.
Thanks
And
so much for having me, Jamie.
Yeah, thanks
And
for
everything.
doing this. So until next time, this will be out every Wednesday all through 2021, and we'll see you next time.
Exciting.
Thank you so much for watching this week's episode. If you want to see more, go ahead and hit the subscribe button so that we end up in your feed. If you got something out of this personally that was helpful to you, also please leave a comment below. I love hearing the feedback about what's working and what's not. That's what makes this show better. And until next time, love you more, and we'll see you then.